Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek, Chapter 18. Before we begin our study of the present middle passive indicative, a bit of review is in order. We've previously learned the present active indicative. That form of the Greek verb is formed by combining the present stem plus a connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, plus the primary active endings, nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, nsi. The resulting forms are from first person singular to third person plural, leo, lies, liae, liamen, liate, liusi. We have also looked at contract verbs. These are verbs where the present stem ends in an alpha, epsilon, or omicron, such as agapao, poieo, and pleroo. In looking at these types of verbs, we've focused on the contraction that occurs between the stem vowel and the connecting vowel. We have identified 5 rules that explain the origins of the contractions omicron upsilon, eta iota, omega, alpha, eta, and omicron iota. Being familiar with these rules is necessary to fully unpack the forms. In today's lesson, we'll look at the present middle passive indicatives. We'll start by discussing the passive voice. Then we'll look at the particular forms that make up the present passive indicative. We'll take up the concept of deponent verbs, verbs with passive endings but active meanings. We'll comment on the present middle indicative, and then we'll look at how these forms play themselves out in contract verbs. It's kind of a long lesson, so let's get started. In the active voice, the subject does the acting. I hit the ball. But in the passive voice, the action is being done to the subject by some other agency, either a person or a thing. English uses helping words to convey the passive voice. I am being consumed by debt, for example. They are being consumed by their worries, as another example. One of the helps to identify the passive voice is a prepositional phrase which begins with the word by. For example, I am consumed by my homework. Greek doesn't use helping words to form the passive. Rather, it uses a second set of personal endings. For the present tense, that set is the primary middle passive set. Let's now look at the forms of the present passive indicative. You will recall that the present active indicative was formed by a combination of the present stem, a connecting vowel, and a primary active personal ending. The present passive indicative is formed similarly, present stem, connecting vowel, but a different set of personal endings called the primary passive endings. The change is to the ending. Everything else is the same. The active personal endings, primary actives, are nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, and nsi. We've learned those before. In this lesson, we have a new set. These are the primary middle passive endings. The first person singular is my, mu, alpha, iota. The second person singular is psi, sigma, alpha, iota. The third person singular is tai, tau, alpha, iota. The first person plural is metha, mu, epsilon, theta, alpha. The second person plural is ste, sigma, theta, epsilon. And the third person plural is ntai, nu, tau, alpha, iota. As with the primary active set, this set must also be memorized. It's one of 4 sets. Once we have them learned, we have all that we need for the indicative verb. To help you envision the chart of personal endings, with today's lesson, we now have half of the personal endings memorized. So committing this sequence to memory is important. My, psi, tai, metha, st, ntai. Next, we need to add them to the present stem and the connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon. The rule for connecting vowel is that an omicron is used before a mu or a nu. Epsilon is used in all other cases. So the first person singular would consist of li, the present stem, plus omicron before mu, alpha, iota. Liamai would be the form. The second person singular adds an epsilon before the ending sigma, alpha, iota. But this form is a bit unusual because something happens to it on the way to its final form. The combination epsilon, sigma, alpha, iota causes the sigma to drop out, leaving a combination of epsilon, alpha, iota. By Rule 5 of the contraction rules, epsilon plus alpha contracts to eta, with a iota following. However, the iota does not stand behind an eta. Instead, it subscripts. So, si contracts down to eta with the iota subscript. The second person singular connecting vowel and ending contract to eta, iota subscript. This is the hard one. From now on, they're all easy. Third person singular uses an epsilon before tai, the form liatai. First person plural uses an omicron before the mu of metha, liamatha. Notice the accent is on the omicron. Remember the rule of accents? Moving backwards from the ultima, the last syllable, if the ultima is short, as in this case the alpha is, one goes back to the antepenult, the omicron. The form of the second person plural adds an epsilon to the sigma of the st ending. The form is liast. And in the third person plural, an omicron is added before the nu of ntai, and the form is li-ontai. In the present passives, the connecting vowels are much more obvious than they are in the present actives, with the exception of that pesky second person singular. Now that we know some forms, let's try translating. Li-esthai, second person plural, present passive. You plural are being loosed. Pastuantai, the ntai is the third person plural ending. They are being believed. Blepe, eta with the iota subscript is the second person singular. You singular are being seen. Akuetai, tai is the third person singular. He, she, or it is being heard. In all of these examples, notice the action is being done to the subject. Ekomatha, the amatha ending, is first person plural. We are being held. Having stepped through the forms of the passive voice and looked at some examples of how to translate them, passive endings, the action is done on the subject, we now turn to deponent verbs, which reverse what's happening. Deponent verbs are passive, or middle in form, but active in meaning. So, for example, erkamai looks like it's a passive, but it's translated, I come or go. It's active. Many times, deponent verbs are actually intransitive. They're the kind of verbs that don't take a direct object. How can you tell if a verbal form is deponent? Here, you have to check the dictionary or vocabulary list. If the dictionary form ends in an omega, then a passive form is passive. But if the dictionary form ends in omicron, mu, alpha, iota, oh my, we sometimes say, it's a deponent. When parsing these forms that are middle or passive in form but active in meaning, the best thing to do is simply to say that they are deponent in terms of their voice. A couple of notes. A verb tense will either be regular or deponent. A particular tense doesn't switch from regular to deponent and back and forth. However, and we won't deal with this for a while, a verb may be deponent in one tense and not in another. We'll save that somewhat more awkward circumstance for next semester. Some examples of translation. Apokrinetai. The tai ending is third person singular, passive, but the dictionary form is apokrinomai. This verb is deponent, so we translate it actively. She answers. Poryuamatha, again, metha, passive ending, but the dictionary form is poryuomai, so the translation is active. We go. Dinantai. The ending, ntai, is passive, third plural. But the dictionary form is dinamai, so the verb is deponent. They are able. By the way, this is one of the rare verbs where the normal connecting vowels of omicron and epsilon are replaced by an alpha. So it does look a little bit differently on occasion. Check your vocabulary list for the full details. Legomai. The my ending is passive. The dictionary form is lego. So this is a passive form. I myself am being spoken about. And if you recall that funny video about Koine Greek I showed you previously, this is the legomai ego that they mock in that video. We've looked at passive indicatives of the present and deponent verbs in the present. We now turn to the present middle indicative. In the present, the middle indicative is identical in form to the passive indicative. By looking at a form all by itself, one cannot tell if it's middle or passive in the present. However, for the next several lessons, all the middle forms that you will see are actually deponent verbs, and so they're translated actively. So for now, it's not a challenge. If you see a middle form, but the dictionary form ends in an omicron, mu, alpha, iota, then it would simply be deponent. The classic middle is an action done for the benefit of the subject. For example, the verb perithithetai. Notice the tie ending, third person singular. It could be middle, it could be passive. This one happens to be middle. She dresses herself. The action is done for the benefit of the subject. Using the deponent verb erkomai, you can see that the formation of the middle is identical to the formation of the passive in the present tense. Erkomai, erke, erketai, erkamatha, erkesthe, erkontai. The last topic for our consideration in this lesson is what happens when a middle passive ending is added to a contract verb in the present tense. This chart shows the various patterns where a passive ending and a connecting vowel are added to a contract verb. Color-coded are the contractions, and they are all quite straightforward. For example, let's take the first person singular. Alpha plus omicron contracts to omega according to Rule 3. So the form is agapomai. I am being loved. Epsilon contracts with omicron to give the diphthong u, poi umai. I am being made. Omicron contracts with omicron, according to Rule 1, to form the diphthong omicron upsilon. Play rumai, I am being filled. If you look throughout the chart, it's quite easy to see how the contracts work, with the exception of our friend, the second person singular. Each second person singular, alpha plus si, epsilon plus si, or omicron plus si, each of those go through a rather elaborate process of contraction to yield the actual endings that show up. Alpha with iota subscript, eta with iota subscript, or omicron iota. Those contractions are illustrated here. The important point to note is the end result. Alpha plus iota subscript is second person singular, passive. You singular are being loved. Eta plus iota subscript is second person singular. You singular are being made. Omicron iota is also second person singular. You singular are being filled. If this made you a bit nervous, you are correct. The second person singular middle passive happens to be identical to the third person singular active with alpha contracts and omicron contracts. So one must rely on the context. Is the subject you, or is the subject he, she, or it, to determine the difference? Fortunately, with epsilon contracts, the forms are different. That's our lesson. We've looked at the passive voice, the forms of the present passive indicative, deponent verbs, which have passive endings but active meanings, the present middle indicative, which is identical to the present passive indicative, and then the present middle passive contracts.